In the last video of this Django for Beginners series of creating an e-commerce site, we set up our project. This means that we have a file structure that looks like this. If you haven't set up your Django project already, you can go back and watch that video now. It will be in the top right now. In today's video, we are going to be creating a user authentication screen. We will be creating models for users. We'll be looking at how to create views and how to create templates to display the pages we want the user to see. Let's get straight into it. First up, we're going to create a user model. Fortunately, Django comes with a default user model for us, and this authentication model is expandable and customizable. However, by default, it comes with 5 fields: username, first name, last name, email, and a password. To import it, we find it from the Django authentication models, and from there we want to just import user. Once we've imported the default user authentication model, we need to create our own site users model. And so to do that, we just create a class called site users. And this site users is going to be a model to import model as a parameter that has already been imported for us. Now inside this site users class, we need to create a class variable called user. Here we are setting up what a user is going to be. And so in our case, our user is just going to use the default user authentication model provided by Django. And so we want to set up a relationship that our user is going to have a one-to-one relationship with every field inside the user model. And so we use one-to-one field and pass in our default user model as an argument. The second parameter is going to be onDelete. Now onDelete defines what we do when we delete a user, and we want to cascade. This means that when we delete a user, everything that references user will also be deleted. We may also want to customize or add to the fields that the default user model provides us. So for example, in our case, we're going to add a date of birth field. And so to do that, we create another class variable, which we'll call date of birth. Here we need to define what this field is going to accept. And so we only want date of birth to accept a date. We can find a property called date field on our models object. This will mean that date of birth will only accept dates.urls. Next, we need to come into our admin py within our ecom site app and register our site users model. To do this, we first need to import our site users model. So from models, we import site users. And then we write admin.site register site users. We are now going to create a new file called forms. In this file, we will specify what the user types in to a form on the front end, which we'll be defining in HTML later on in the video. And now this form obviously has to provide us with the information that our user model needs. So firstly, in this file, we will import forms from Django. Secondly, as I just mentioned, we need to satisfy our user model, and therefore we will be using that user model when setting up a form. And so we need to import the user model from Django contrib auth models. Thirdly, like in models, Django provided us with a default user model. Django also provides us with a default user creation form, which provides us with a few fields, which we'll go over in a moment. And we can get this from Django contrib auth forms. And from there, we will import user creation form. Now, like in models, we need to create a class to define our form. We'll call this class signup form, and we will pass in user creation form, as that is what we will be using as a base for our form. Now, the user creation form comes with 3 fields: username, password 1, and password 2. Of course, like with the default user model, we can add to this user creation form. Our user model needs 2 additional fields than the one that user creation form provides, and that is the email field and the date of birth field. And so we can add these by just creating a class variable. So we will start by creating a class variable for email, and in this field we need to define how we want to set up what we want to accept in this field. So as this is an email field, we only want to allow email addresses in this field. Fortunately, this type of field can be found on our forms. So we say forms.email field. Now, inside this email field, we can pass in some named parameters that are optional, and there is a range of them to choose from, but for our user signup form, we only need 2 of them. The first one is the maximum length. Now, the maximum length is the largest amount of characters we will accept in our form. Now, we're going to use the value 40 for our signup form, in this video, but you can choose what you like this value to be. I've decided to choose 40, as there has been some studies done on the length of email addresses, and the average length of an email address is 25 characters, but the length of an email varies from about 18 characters all the way up to 33. Now we've gone a bit above the 33 to allow our users a bit more flexibility, whilst not allowing them to go crazy inside our email field. The second parameter, which we will pass in, is defining some help text for our users. Now this gives the user a prompt inside of the text box that they will be typing the email address into. And so here we will let them know that this field is required by just typing in the string required. So the second field is date of birth, and so we set up a variable called date of birth. And again, forms provides us with a date field, so that this field only allows dates. And again, we'll pass in two optional named parameters. The first is going to be initial. Now this is the initial value that our date field will be set to. And we want this to be set to the date that the user is looking at the form, or today's date from their perspective. And we can do this by importing datetime into this file. And on datetime, we find the date, and then on date, we can find today. So this provides us with today's date. And the second parameter will be help text, which again, we'll set to required. Next, we are going to create a class called meta inside our signup form class. In this class, we are going to define what model our form is trying to satisfy. And so we create the class variable model, and we set that to user. Next, we're going to define the fields of our signup form. So we create a class variable called fields. Inside our fields variable, we define the fields. We create a list of the field names that we are using. And so that is username, email, date of birth, password 1, and password 2. The next thing that we're going to be doing is creating a view for our user sign-up process. Now, in short, a view is a Python function that takes a web request and returns a web response. And the view itself contains logic that is necessary to return a response. And so in our view, we're going to be sending some information that is entered on our form and returning some information to the user. So the first thing we want to do in this file is set up a function. And our function is going to be called signup, and this function takes a request. And that request is going to be from our form. And therefore the first thing inside this function is we're going to check if the request has a method of post. Now this will become clearer later on in the video, but essentially this request will be coming from our form, and our form, which we will set up in a moment, will have a post method on it. Now if you're familiar with HTML, you can set up forms that have different methods on them, but a post request is sending data to, for example, a database, and that's how we plan to set up our form in a moment. Inside this if statement, we're then going to create a variable for what our form was, and so we're going to call our variable form. And now at this point, we actually need to import our signup form from our forms file, and so we just say from forms import signup form, and then we let this function know that we were using signup form and the request was a post request. Now we're going to check if this form was valid. And so to do that, we say form.isValid. If the form is valid, then we want to save the form, or save the data inside the form. And now we need to get the data. At this point, we can let the user know whether their request to sign up to our site was successful. And so we will need to import messages from Django. And now here we can say, if this was successful, or if the request was successful, then let the user know that their account was created successfully. And as I just mentioned, each view takes a web request, and as I mentioned at the start of this section, a view is a Python function that takes a web request and returns a response. So we take the web request up here, and now we need to return a response to that request. So here we're going to return render the same page that we're currently viewing. And so we can import that render functionality from Django shortcuts. And so now we can return that render down here, and this render takes a request, or the request that we were given, and then what HTML file to return. And so we will call our HTML file, when we create it in a moment, signup.html. Now of course, we may not always be given a correct request. So for example, if we were given a GET request, we wouldn't want to do this. And so we need an else clause. And so if the request method is not post, we want to just return a blank form. So we will say form equals signup form, and this returns a blank response. And if that's the case, for the moment, we will just render our request and signup.html. so the user can try again. Now, later in this series, we'll be coming back to this view because, for example, we may want to, once the user has signed in, automatically log the user in with that information, and we will be looking at that in future videos. Now that we have done some work on the back end, we can now start to create some of the front end, or what the user sees when they try to sign up for our site. And so to do this, we need to create some HTML files. Now in Django, these are called templates. We will be looking at templates in more detail in future videos in this series, but to give a quick overview, templates, whilst HTML, also allow us to extend and inherit parts of other templates. So, now the first thing we need to do is to come into our ecom site app, or whatever you have called your application, and create a new directory. And this directory we are going to call templates. In this directory, we're going to create a new HTML file, which we'll call base. Now, in future videos, we will come to edit base. But essentially, this base file is the basis for every page on our site. So for example, if we think of an application like Instagram, has that menu on the page somewhere which allows us to transfer between home, search, the create post page, our activity page, and our profile. And so if Instagram were using Django, in their base file, they could potentially have that menu. But for now, in our base file, we will just define a title, which we'll call e-commerce site. And then inside the body, we'll just let this HTML file know that there's going to be some block content, and then we're going to end the content at the end of the body, for which we type the curly bracket, and then a percentage sign, and then end block, and then close the percentage sign and the curly brackets. Now, every other HTML file we create for our application will extend this base HTML file. So, to create a HTML file for our sign up page, we're now going to create another HTML file, which we'll call sign up. Now, as we have told PyCharm that this is going to be a HTML file, it has added some tags for us, the HTML tag, the body tag, and a head tag. But we've already defined these tags inside of our base HTML file, and so we don't need these tags anymore, so we can just delete them. And instead, we can say that this file extends base HTML. We are then going to say that the block content starts here. At the top of our page, we want a header that lets our user know that this is the sign up page, and we will use the h2 tag for that. Now this is where our form is going to live. And so we use the form tag, and inside here we're going to define the method, which is going to be post, which, if you remember back to our view, that is what we told the view to expect that the form method will be. Now we need to tell Django how we want to display our form. And so there are a number of methods on form, but we are going to use the asp method for now. And you'll see what that does when we run the program in a moment. And then at the end of the form, we want a button of type submit, and that has the text on it called sign up. Finally, inside this form, we are going to end block. At this point, you may be thinking, how does this HTML file know what form we want to display? Well, let's look at that now. If we were to run python manage py run server, we are still taken to this page we saw in the setup video. And this is because we haven't set up what this URL is pointing to. We haven't told it to point towards our sign up HTML file, and therefore it just defaults to this page. So now we're going to go into the URLs file and change that. Now, there already is a URLs file made for us within our e-commerce site. However, we want to make one specific to our e-commerce site app. And so we can create a new file that just deals with the URLs for our e-commerce site app by creating a new file here. We start off by importing path and our views. Now we need to specify the name of our app, which is ecom site app. And now we need to set up the patterns for our URLs. So we create a variable called URL patterns. And inside here is where we're going to type the path of the URL and what we want to do when the user goes to that URL. So we use our path, and the first argument we're going to pass in is the path after the first /. And this first parameter is what is entered after that first slash. So in our case, we want this to be blank, because when the user goes to this URL, we want them to be greeted with the sign up page. The next parameter is the views function. We want to handle our web request. And so that is our sign up function. So we say views.signup. And thirdly, we can name what this URL is dealing with, and that is a sign up request. So we'll call it sign up. Now that we have defined an app specific URL, we need to come back into our project URLs dispatcher. Here, we want to tell our project that at any point in the project, include the URLs that are defined in our ecom site app. So to do this, we again use path, and when the path is blank, include the URLs from ecom site app. Now, when we run the program, we are greeted with a form, and this form has all of the fields that we defined in our model and in our form. And so now we can enter some information for a potential user. So we could call our username user, and our email could be user@email.com, as this passes the validation for an email. Our date of birth field has defaulted to today's date, or the date I'm recording this, which is the 3rd of July, and we'll keep that as our date of birth just for this example. And we can type in our own password. And because we have used the default user that Django provides, it comes with some inbuilt validation, and so our password has to meet this criteria. And so now when we press sign up, we are at the moment greeted with an empty form. And that's because we defined it like that in our view. Our view received a request and gave a response of an empty form. Now, of course, in future videos, we will change this so that it gives the user a more satisfying experience. But this is how to create a sign-up form in Python for Django. Thank you for watching the video this far. I hope you got a lot of value from it. If you'd like to see more Python programming tutorials, there will be a link in the description down below to a playlist of Python programming tutorials. With that said, if you like the video, if you could drop a like on the video, it would be much appreciated, as it really helps the channel, and subscribe to see new Python programming tutorials every week. Also, if you've got any questions about the video, drop a comment down below and I'll get back to you. Have a great day.